If God be for us, who can be against us? He who spared his only Son, gave him up for us, how shall he not freely give us all things? Amen. Here we pick up with chapter 6 in Dr. MacCulloch's Thomas Cranmer, page 225, talking about prayer book revision. Prayer book revision. Cranmer did not cease to work on his revision when the German ambassadors left in October 1538. They'd about had enough of Cranmer and Henry. They were not a happy crowd. In fact, the bulk of the work on the revision was probably done in the winter of 1539, which is another bad year for Cranmer. It marks the beginning of some serious setbacks for several years, when he may have had more leisure than during the embassy itself with the Germans there. Henry saw Charles V and Francis I kissing and making up and exposing Henry to a lonely position. So he and Cromwell begin some political negotiations with the Schmalkald article. Cromwell, of course, it's more political, and Henry, it's very political. And Henry wants really no part of the German Reformation in his country, as the 6 articles of 1539 will illustrate. There's evidence of the letter of 8 March 1538 already mentioned. If that is thought to be an unreliable witness, there is a passing remark in one of his letters, April 11, 1539, which is almost certainly a reference to the fair copy of the Breviary manuscript which we possess today, proto-liturgical work before, which will come down 10 years later. Writing to Cromwell, I call him, Cranmer had said that he left his chaplain, Francis Millay, down at Ford Palace, according to your lordship's assignment, occupied in the affairs of our church service. Now Mallet had come up to Croydon at the writing up of so much as he had to do, and after seeing Cromwell, he would return for furtherance and final finishing up of that which we have begun. So Cromwell and Cranmer are conspiring together, and within a year, 1540, Cromwell's head will be rolling. The surviving scheme is written in 2 hands, the second of which is that of Ralph Maurice, Cranmer's secretary. It is likely that the first hand is Mallet's. In addition to the breviary, it is more likely that Cranmer made proposals for baptism and marriage services, which he would use eventually in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. However, at some point after April 1539, work on the manuscript ceased. The table of lessons for half the year were never filled in, given the traumatic events of May and June 1539, which culminated in the passage of the 6 articles. One can only understand too well why Cromwell and Cranmer dropped their scheme and why the work of revising the liturgy was postponed. While German negotiations were dribbling towards their apparently unsatisfactory conclusion, the king gave dramatic, indeed destructive support to one aspect of Cromwell's campaign for evangelical advance. The chain of circumstances is complex and has a strange beginning in an entirely different preoccupation of Henry's. He was taken up during the summer with enthusiasm for winning a French bride. Almost anyone would do, it seemed. At the end of August, he indulged his temporary Francophile passion by giving a lavish welcome to Madame de Montreal, a former senior attendant of the recently deceased French-born Queen Madeleine of Scotland. Her duties at an end, she was passing through England from Scotland on her way home to France and would travel on from London to Kent. Henry decided to combine business with pleasure by making a rendezvous with her after he had inspected the defenses at Dover. She was accompanied south by the French ambassador. Part of Madame's tourist schedule on the way down was a stay in Canterbury, where on 31 August she made a lengthy visit to the cathedral. She was treated by Prior Goldwell and his brethren with a special viewing of the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, complete with traditional ceremonies. Her English escort, Sir William Pennison, noted with interest that she refused to do reverence at the solemn exposition of the saint's head, although she was duly impressed with the staggering wealth of the shrine. Goldwell never again had a chance to show off the Holy Skull, and one wonders whether Madame's visit clinched a plan of action already in Henry's mind. Back in London, Cromwell was drafting up a set of draft vicegerential injunctions, which among the new orders made finally clear that every parish church is supposed to buy a Bible in English. Those injunctions were promulgated by the archbishops during October. Cromwell's first draft was that it was exhibited on 5 September, and it is unlikely that this refers to an inspection by the vicegerent himself. This was surely the date on which it was shown to the king in Kent for his scrutiny. Alterations were immediately made after this date. When the injunctions were issued in print, they had only 2 new items at the end, all of which presented fresh attacks on the devotion to the saints, and especially on the feasts of Thomas Becket. Ever since Henry had discovered that he was supreme head of the Church of England, he had detested the memory of Becket, whose cult represented the triumph of the Western Church over the King of England. But this added clause to the injunctions had urgent practical relevance. It gave backing to the destruction of Becket's shrine and apparently even his bones in Canterbury Cathedral, perhaps the most spectacular single piece of iconoclasm so far in the English Church. Indeed, the destruction of the shrine was the primary reason stated for the papal promulgation of Henry VIII's excommunication 3 months later. The shrine took several days, around September 8, to dismantle, and the scandalized ex-monk of St. Augustine's, Canterbury, who recorded the atrocity, also noted the simultaneous prohibition of Becket's feast days. That same night, 8 September, Cromwell's evangelical impresario and playwright John Bale staged a play before king and court at Canterbury. It is hardly stretching coincidence too far to suggest that the work performed was Bale's on the Treasons of Becket. Sometime in the next week, Cromwell appeared at the cathedral and ordered the monks to change their habits, presumably abandoning the Benedictine costume in preparation for the cathedral priory becoming a secular foundation. But for some reason, the drastic step was postponed another 18 months. Who should take credit or blame for Becket's final annihilation? The earliest initiation was a week or two before Henry set out for Kent, when Cranmer suggested to Cromwell that it was time to have all the relics preserved in his cathedral investigated with a skeptical eye. However, typically in Cranmer and Cromwell's relationship, this was a more modest suggestion than the savage spectacle which ensued. The presence of Bale and his players at Canterbury was clearly planned, and only Cromwell could have done the planning. Wriothesley's record records his simultaneous unleashing of the anti-Becket campaign in London. It is likely that Cromwell put the idea into Henry's head of combining his visit to Kent with an emphatic end to the Becket cult, and then Madame de Montreal's less than traditional reaction to the traditional splendors of the shrine clinched the king's purpose, giving Cromwell the go-ahead. Hence the sudden addition to the injunctions between 5 and 8 September. The actual dismantling was performed by Richard Pollard, an agent of Cromwell and not of the Archbishop, although Cranmer was in other instances happy to lend his servants as agents in the acts of iconoclastic vandalism as the campaign against holy places and sacred images progressed during late 1538. Canterbury was the first leg of Pollard's campaign of destruction, which continued at the end of the month in Winchester. Another indication that Cromwell was waiting for royal approval until the last moment before unleashing his final assault on cathedral shrines in England. One direct contribution by the Archbishop to this putsch against Canterbury's old patron was to add to Becket's symbolic oblivion by commissioning the recutting of the official seals of the archdiocese and its prerogative court. From the 12th century on, these featured their central panel, Thomas Becket and his martyrdom. And Cranmer had continued this tradition when he became archbishop. His first seal for the archdiocese was simply a recutting of arms, adding his own family arms to the bottom and altering the legend. The second seal hardly altered the first design, which still centered on the martyrdom of Becket. From 1538, the central panel was entirely changed, and the crucifixion put in place of the death of the archbishop. Cranmer also decided to impale the arms of the archdiocese with those of the cathedral priory, rather than with a version of his own family coat. A similar transformation occurred on the prerogative seal. A different treatment of Becket's martyrdom was replaced in a cutting of the same matrix by the scourging of Christ. Sir Thomas Cheney, casting an unsympathetic eye over official acts of the archdiocese, would have been able to note this newly Christocentric iconography, and call to mind the Archbishop's words to him the previous year, that the first necessary condition for salvation was our justification by Christ's passion only. In good pantomime fashion, at this moment of symbolic evangelical triumph in September 1538, the villain entered from the wings, Stevie Gardiner. He'd been away for full 3 years on his French embassy, but now he had been recalled, and he crossed the Channel to England, much changed in his absence. His disembarkation at Dover about 26 September was an anxious moment for all concerned, particularly in view of the vicious rows which had exploded between him and his successor as ambassador in France, Edmund Bonner, at that stage a protege of Cromwell's. Hence his every move was scrutinized for signs of trouble. However, Gardiner was expansively in a conciliatory mood when he arrived in Kent. He pronounced himself well satisfied with the destruction of Becket's shrine and wished for similar action in his own cathedral. This was disingenuous. He must have known that it had just taken place. He was equally complimentary about Cromwell's injunctions, although he sieged gleefully on the implication in them that the King's Majesty will not leave this auricular confession, an ominous indication that his cooperation with the evangelical program would be on his own terms. Glyn Redworth, in his biography of Gardiner, has cautioned against accepting too readily the evangelical historiography of Gardiner, the arch-villain in the cosmic struggle for the soul of Tudor England. This is a healthy warning, but it can hardly be coincident that for 3 years while in France, the progress of evangelical change never suffered a major reversal, progressing even in the face of Anne Boleyn's death and the explosion of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Moreover, almost from the moment of Gardiner's arrival back in London, the emphasis of royal religious policy began to change. Cromwell could not afford to resist this shift, given the precarious state of his political battle with the Courtenays and the Poles. And where Cromwell led, that's where Cranmer would follow. The keynote of the autumn 1538 was resistance to religious radicalism, a cause which the evangelical leadership certainly could not resist, and indeed could support with a good conscience, as did the conservatives. After the initial flurry of persecution of Anabaptists back in 1535, the English radicals had been left in comparative peace and had maintained their contacts with like-minded groups on the continent, as radicalism sought to rebuild its identity in the wake of the Munster catastrophe. The English radicals indeed played a prominent role in the continental radical discussions. Now their luck changed once more. One must concede that Dr. Redworth, that besides the presence of Cranmer, a major new stimulus for the new line came from an entirely different direction from the continent via Anglo-German contacts of 1538. The German evangelical leaders took major steps to curb radicalism in this year, and at the forefront of that continental action was Martin Bucer. Strasbourg passed fresh legislation to curb Anabaptists, and Landgrave Philip of Hesse also swooped down on Anabaptist gatherings. On 1 September, the Duke of Saxony and Landgrave sent to England an urgent warning letter which included alarming extracts of radical correspondence sieged in Hesse. These referred in glowing terms to radical progress in England, including the publication of an English work which expressed unorthodox views about the nature of Christ. One notes that the princes were desperate to dissociate such disgraceful ideas from Lutheranism, into which they hoped to entice Henry VIII. The same defensiveness affected the English evangelicals and afforded the perfect opportunity for conservatives to sweep up opponents on the fringes of the evangelical establishment and sweep them in by a net of oppression. And of course, Henry will follow that ethos. The reaction of German and English government establishments to the same problem in 1538 was significantly different. In Strasbourg, threats of capital punishment for obstinate radicalism remained a dead letter, while in Hesse, the Landgrave went on to invite Bucer into his territory to persuade radicals into conformity by disputation. The resulting mass conversion back to the territorial church was virtually unique in Europe during the 16th century. In England, the combination of conservatives savoring the chance for a comeback, coupled with the customary savagery of Henry VIII in reaction to religious dissent, the sequel was a good deal more ruthless than our telling here. English reaction to the German letter was remarkably swift. An English translation by Richard Morrison of the German letter survives from 25 September 1538. And within a week, a vicegerential commission had been issued against the Anabaptists. Its membership was notably bipartisan, reflecting the way in which it was possible for the Anabaptists to be a unifying force in England's religious divisions. Cranmer headed it with Heath, Barnes, and Edward Crome representing the evangelicals. Sampson and Stokesley, the conservatives, with John Skipp, Thomas Thirlby, and Richard Gwent, more equivocal figures. One uniting factor in the group was that whatever their chief preferment, they were mainly active in London and in the southeast. During the autumn of 1538, there are records of various Anabaptists being burnt in London and Colchester, mostly Dutch refugees. However, caught up in the net were a number of evangelical activists whom it was hard to prevent being treated the same way as those of more radical inclinations. One burning in particular was John Lambert, alias Nicholson, would prove a sad embarrassment for Cranmer's long-term reputation. That's quite the statement. And I agree with Dr. MacCulloch here. In some cases, it was the unorthodox style of evangelical activists which attracted official suspicion. Such was the case with a Lollard bricklayer from Whitechapel, John Heredance, whose gift for preaching was not inhibited by his illiteracy, nor improvised settings in the open air or in his own house. Such a character as Heredance was bound to infuriate the authorities, and his examination became yet another distraction for bishops at Lambeth in the summer of 1538. despite the lack of any substantial doctrinal matters to charge him with, he ended up bearing a faggot as an abjured heretic after the alarms of autumn. However, the main Achilles heel for fringe evangelicals in the persecution remained Eucharistic theology. The extent of official evangelical sensitivity on this had been revealed by an incident in the summer of 1538, when Vice-Chancellor Burchard had made urgent representations to Cranmer and Sampson to have the penance of one Atkinson relocated from Paul's Cross to the less public setting of his parish church. We do not know what Atkins' precise Eucharistic views were, but the two bishops concurred in referring the request for Cromwell's decision, meanwhile telling Burchard that they were opposed to a concession, as that error of the sacrament of the altar was so greatly spread abroad in this realm. Charles Smith made too much of this, wrongly setting it as conclusive evidence that Cranmer's Eucharistic views never went through a Lutheran phase. That's Smith's Cranmer. In fact, all it demonstrates is the uneasy balance of forces between an evangelical and conservative bishop at Lambeth that summer. Cranmer's wish not to be seen stepping out of line, and the Bucerian generosity of the evangelical visitor trying to avoid undue humiliation for a harmless individual whom he favored. The disaster which befell John Lambert well illustrates the evangelical establishment's continual hard line on the corporeal presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the issue which had bedeviled relationships in Europe and Strasbourg over the previous 2 years. What is evident from the embarrassed account in Fox's narrative on Lambert is that it was the evangelicals who caused his downfall. Lambert began by arguing with John Taylor, Bishop of Lincoln under Edward VI, about the Eucharist. Taylor called on Barnes to back him up, confuting Luther, and he, in turn, decided that Cranmer needed to be brought in. These are all evangelicals circling around. They smell blood in the water on Lambert. This is not done by the papists. And after the archbishop examined Lambert, he was confined to Lambeth Palace, where they had a jail. He is then said to have appealed to the king, a highly unwise move in the autumn of 1538. Whether or not we accept Fox's suggestion that Gardiner orchestrated Henry's actions, it is clear that the king was now taking a highly active interest in his religious policy. He decided to single out Lambert for destruction by summoning a heresy tribunal at Westminster, over which he would preside in person as the supreme head of the church. It was a remarkable meeting, which, given its attendance of bishops, noblemen, justices, members of parliament, sundry dignitaries, and the king, may be reckoned in addition to the sequence of the Tudor Great Councils compiled by Dr. Holmes. This in itself is a measure of the importance of the Lambert case in 1538, which has proven to be a justifiable stain, irremovable stain on Cranmer's career. With St. Paul following John Calvin, we say at the close of this session, if God be for us, who can be against us? If God spared not his own Son in delivering him up for us, how shall he not freely give us all things? Who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifies. And he spared his own Son, who is risen, who is now at the right hand of God the Father, interceding for us and pleading his righteous, efficacious, and omnipotent merits. As Paul concludes, who can separate us from the love of God? I am convinced that nothing can separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. Until next time, Godspeed.